Most investors saw nothing unusual this week, but institutions saw something very different, and they just sent a signal that almost no retail XRP holder understands. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't speculation, and it wasn't social media noise. It was a structural shift visible only to people who track the behavior of liquidity providers, settlement networks, and global value movers. A shift that directly impacts XRP's role going forward. Before we unpack what happened, take a moment to like this video so more XRP holders get research grounded in reality. Subscribe to Blockchain of Ra so you never miss a major systemic signal. And remember, this is not financial advice. This is deep analysis based on public data, Ripple documentation, and institutional liquidity behavior. As of right now, XRP is trading around the $2 range. Here's what triggered everything. Several global institutions, including settlement providers, cross-border payment networks, and even traditional market makers began quietly adjusting their liquidity pathways. They are preparing for the next phase of real-time settlement. And whenever institutional pathways shift, XRP's role in the system becomes more important, not because of speculation, but because the architecture of global value movement is changing. Ripple's leadership has been signaling this transition for more than a year. Brad Garlinghouse noted publicly that global settlement is moving from innovation into implementation, meaning institutions are done experimenting and are now preparing to operate on faster rails. David Schwartz mentioned that settlement efficiency becomes a necessity when liquidity pressure rises across markets. And that is exactly what the institutional signal confirms. Pressure is building. Foreign exchange markets are compressing. Bond markets are showing rapid liquidity rotation. Tokenization pilots across banks and custodians are accelerating. These are not isolated events. They are symptoms of a global system being forced to evolve. When multiple markets tighten simultaneously, institutions begin searching for a unified liquidity bridge, something neutral, fast, and scalable. XRP was engineered for this exact moment. The signal institutions just sent wasn't a loud announcement. It was a shift in positioning. Corridor providers increased throughput. Settlement firms adjusted routing logic. A small number of banks expanded their internal token flow testing. None of this made headlines, but these are the early signs that the system is preparing for activation. The point where the old rails can no longer support the volume, speed, or complexity of modern value movement. And this is where most retail investors miss the plot entirely. They watch for candles. Institutions watch for liquidity behavior. They monitor how assets move under stress. They analyze how much capital is trapped in slow settlement. They calculate how much can be saved by switching rails. And when those calculations reach a certain threshold, the system shifts automatically. That threshold is being reached right now. The institutional signal isn't hype. It's a warning, a quiet structural indication that real-time settlement is becoming necessary, and the asset that bridges that settlement is entering its next phase of relevance. XRP doesn't surge because retail decides it should. It surges when the system demands the rail it runs on. In the next section, we're going to break down exactly what this institutional signal was, why it impacts Ripple's ecosystem directly, and how it marks the beginning of a new phase that most holders will only recognize after it has already begun. To understand why the institutional signal matters, you have to understand what institutions actually adjust when they anticipate a major shift in settlement. Infrastructure. They don't tweet. They don't publish headlines. They move liquidity, quietly, strategically, and almost always before the public realizes what's happening. The signal that appeared this week came from a pattern Ripple has talked about publicly for years. Changes in cross-border liquidity routing. When global payment firms, corridor operators, and market makers rebalance their flows, they reveal their internal expectations for future settlement pressure. These movements are subtle, but they are unmistakable to anyone who studies liquidity cycles the way banks do. Ripple's own documentation explains how these early signals show up. Corridors begin to widen, throughput increases, pilot volumes expand, and institutions start rerouting value toward faster, more efficient pathways. None of this looks dramatic on the surface, but these are the exact behaviors that precede a shift from testing mode to operational mode, and this is precisely what is beginning to happen. In the last cycle of institutional adjustments, liquidity providers shifted flows into regions where RippleNet and on-demand liquidity were quietly expanding. Now we're seeing a similar pattern, but on a larger scale. Ripple has publicly confirmed increased activity across corridors, especially in regions preparing for tokenized value movement. Banks and settlement firms are positioning themselves for real-time settlement because the cost of slow rails is becoming a liability. This is where the macro picture comes in. Gold markets are moving faster than at any time in the past decade. Bond markets are undergoing rapid liquidity rotation as interest rate cycles shift. Foreign exchange markets are tightening with higher volatility compressing settlement timelines. And tokenization across custodians, exchanges, and financial institutions introduces a new requirement. Liquidity must be available instantly. In this environment, any asset that acts as a bridge between tokenized and traditional liquidity becomes critical. That bridge can't be slow. It can't be tied to a single jurisdiction. It can't be burdened with legacy settlement delays. It must be neutral, scalable, and engineered for high-speed movement. This is where XRP enters the picture, not as a speculative asset, but as infrastructure. Ripple has been clear publicly that XRP is designed to remove friction from cross-border value movement. But what institutions just signaled is that friction is reaching the point where it's no longer acceptable. Liquidity providers are beginning to adjust their flows in anticipation of tighter settlement requirements. And when settlement requirements tighten, demand doesn't gradually shift, it snaps. This is why Ripple publishes escrow data monthly. As institutions use more XRP for settlement experiments and pilot corridors, the amount available for private over-the-counter sourcing gradually contracts. And when OTC supply tightens, institutions eventually need to touch public liquidity. That is the exact crossover point that begins a repricing phase. The only people who see this early are those watching channels, flows, and movement, not charts. The signal institutions just sent is that we are entering the compression phase, the moment before activation. When liquidity pathways begin shifting toward the rails they know they'll eventually depend on. Most investors won't notice this shift until after the system makes its move. But for those watching liquidity behavior, settlement patterns, and institutional routing logic, the message is already clear. The next section will break down what this signal means for XRP's role in the coming settlement cycle and why this transition will redefine how investors understand the asset entirely. The most important part of this institutional signal isn't what it reveals about today. It's what it tells us about the direction the global system is moving in. Institutions don't reposition liquidity unless they expect the underlying rails to change. And when multiple institutions shift their routing logic at the same time, it means a deeper transformation is already underway. Ripple's leadership has been consistent. The move toward real-time settlement isn't a possibility. It is an inevitability. The settlement architecture of the old financial system was never designed for tokenized assets, 24-hour markets, or instantaneous global value movement. As more of the world's assets become digital, the need for a neutral, high-speed settlement bridge increases exponentially. This is why the actions institutions just took matter, not because they are speculative, but because they are preparatory. Liquidity providers are positioning themselves ahead of the shift. They're adjusting corridors in regions where RippleNet infrastructure is already built. They're routing value through faster pathways. They're preparing for an environment where settlement is measured in seconds, not days. And when a system begins preparing, it becomes evident which tools it will rely on. XRP is one of those tools designed not for hype, but for throughput, not for trends, but for liquidity, not for speculation, but for settlement. The institutional signal is simple. The rails are being chosen. Not someday, not theoretically, now. And this is where most retail investors remain completely unaware. They are waiting for headlines while institutions are watching for friction. They are watching price while institutions are watching settlement cost. They are interpreting noise while institutions are reacting to pressure. But pressure is what forces change. And the global financial system is under more pressure now than at any point in the past decade. Bond market volatility, gold, flow rotation, foreign exchange compression, and accelerating tokenization all point to the same conclusion. The world needs real-time, efficient, neutral settlement. Ripple's public acknowledgement that the system is entering its implementation phase wasn't a prediction. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the infrastructure is ready, that demand is rising, and that the global liquidity cycle is aligning with the exact utility XRP was created to provide. If you are here listening to this, it means you are paying attention to the part of the system most investors never see. The part that moves quietly, the part that reveals itself only in the behavior of institutions, and the part that always signals before the chart reacts. So before you go, take a moment to support this community of early thinkers and informed holders. Tap like so more XRP investors get real research instead of guesswork. Subscribe to Matrix Millionaire so you stay ahead of every institutional signal, every liquidity shift, and every structural change unfolding behind the scenes. And drop one word in the comments: aligned. Because that is exactly what the institutions are, and exactly what you are now. This moment is not about hype. It is about readiness. The institutions have made their move, and the system is shifting toward the rails built for the future. Welcome to Matrix Millionaire. The next signal is already forming.